Hello Year 10, so this is the night before news video for your English Literature Paper 1 exam, which you're going to be sitting tomorrow morning. So in this presentation we're going to look at the two texts, Macbeth and A Christmas Carol, and revise some key themes and characters around them. All you'll need for this is a pen and some lined paper to write on. Okay, so we're going to start with Macbeth, and we're going to start with the character of Lady Macbeth. Now, Lady Macbeth wasn't actually one of the characters that we asked you to revise. Those were Banquo and Macbeth as the options that could come up tomorrow. But I thought that we'd look at Lady Macbeth in this session because she's a really interesting character, and you could refer to her in any answer that you're writing because she's such a central and important character in the play. So even though you won't get a question on Lady Macbeth tomorrow, you could still write about her, and that's why I've chosen this topic to revise. So first thing, on your sheet of paper, create a mind map for any ideas that you can think of regarding Lady Macbeth. How is she presented? What does she do in the play? How does that link to context? Anything that you can remember about her, including quotations as well.
Okay, so here is the modelled example of that mind map. There are a number of points, but I think the main one that you'd want to be focusing on in a response to Lady Macbeth is that she is an atypical woman. That means that she does not fit the normal conventions or stereotypes of a woman at that time. There's a few reasons for that. Firstly, she is ambitious. She is the one at the start of the play that drives the plot to kill King Duncan, and you can see that in Act 1, Scene 5, when she asks for the supernatural for help, and she tries to become less feminine and more masculine. So you can see that at the bottom left, she renounces her femininity, gives it up, and calls upon supernatural powers to help her become deviant, help her become evil. So we clearly see her aligned with evil, which would be shocking to a Jacobean audience. She's also manipulative. She is the dominant partner at the start of the play in a relationship. She manipulates Macbeth by emasculating him, questioning his masculinity, and as a result of that, Macbeth is driven to commit regicide. So it's Lady Macbeth that is driving the kind of evil plot, the regicide, at the start of the play. However, it's also important to remember that she suffers the consequences of that. After Macbeth becomes king, she becomes marginalised. He shuts her out of the decision-making process. And that's the first kind of recalibration of the convention. So Macbeth becomes the dominant partner again. And then at the end of the play, she is driven mad by her guilt and overwhelmed and hallucinates. And at the end, off stage, commits suicide. So the key thing with Lady Macbeth is that the punishment from God is there for disrupting the natural order. Those are the key points that we want to make. Okay, so next stage is to think about planning our response and starting with our thesis statement. So if we were asked a question about how does Shakespeare present Lady Macbeth in the play, what would you say? So draft out a thesis statement in response to that question, focusing on some of the big ideas that we discussed in the mind map. Okay, here's your model example. So we've got that keyword in that first sentence, atypical. She doesn't fit the gender stereotypes of the Jacobean era. And we've also got a sense that she's ambitious and cruel, as well as capable of manipulating or persuading her husband to commit a crime against God. So all of that fits into the idea that she's atypical, that she's rebelling, challenging God, which she's therefore punished for later in the play. And the key thing I think with this thesis statement is that last sentence. In presenting her in this way, Shakespeare conveys the dangers of subverting the natural order. So that's the big idea, isn't it? That Shakespeare's telling us through this play that you shouldn't challenge God's will, you shouldn't challenge God's power, and you shouldn't try and disrupt the natural order. And doing so brings about terrible consequences. So that's really the point that we're driving to in an essay about Lady Macbeth. Okay, so next stage would be to find your evidence. So we've already identified some key scenes here for you. Lady Macbeth's evil nature as portrayed in Act 1, Scene 5. Lady Macbeth's manipulation of Macbeth, in the same scene, and Lady Macbeth's persuasion. There are other scenes that you could look at, but let's start with those. Doesn't necessarily matter if you don't know which scene it comes from, but think about the quotes that you can remember that you could use to talk about Lady Macbeth. Okay, on this slide and the next slide are some examples of key quotes for Lady Macbeth. So what you want to be doing is looking at these quotes and thinking about, okay, if I was going to use this quote what would I say about it? How would I analyse it? How would I look at language techniques or methods? And how could I link it back to my key points? So have a look through the quotes on the next 2 slides and start revising those, perhaps turning them into some flashcards if you wish. So our next stage is to practice some language analysis with the quotation explosion. So the key steps are outlined there, and we're going to do that on the next slide. So here we have our first quote. So we're going to look at the first quote for Lady Macbeth. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty. So have a think about the individual connotations of each of the words highlighted and coloured. Also think about any methods used here by the writer, and also try and link that back to the writer's intention. So here is the model of that quotation explosion. So we've got the idea that Lady Macbeth is using an imperative verb in come. She's commanding the spirits, which is also quite a challenging thing to do, because it's showing that she wants to be in charge of supernatural forces. What she wants them to do is unsex her, which means she wants to renounce or give up her femininity to become more masculine, take on masculine characteristics, and in doing so that disrupts the natural order. Crown, she means a head, but there's also a possible secondary meaning of or foreshadowing of the act of regicide that's to come through that image. And also direst cruelty means the worst kind of evil. So Lady Macbeth doesn't just want to be cruel, she wants to be extremely cruel and to be completely evil and taken over by evil intentions. And Shakespeare's doing that to show that Lady Macbeth has no hesitation in wanting to become evil. She has no doubt in her mind, unlike Macbeth. So this is a good quote to use to show the difference between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth's attitudes at the start of the play. Okay, now we've got a second quotation explosion. A little water clears us of this deed. So this was said after the murder of Duncan. So again, repeat the process as we did for the last quotation explosion. Okay, here you've got your modelled example. So it basically shows the lack of guilt that Lady Macbeth has here. She thinks that only a little water will be able to clear them of it, get rid of the guilt, the stain of the blood. So it shows that she doesn't think it's kind of a significant thing that they've murdered Duncan. She wants to be very pragmatic and practical and forget about it. She doesn't fear the consequences, and she doesn't think that there will be any kind of long-term punishment, which is ironic because later in the play we see that she is indeed haunted by her guilt. Okay, here is a model example of a paragraph that puts all of that information together. So have a very good read through it, look at the different points and how that relates to what we've done on the previous slides. Use that as a starting point to perhaps write a second paragraph now about Lady Macbeth from another point in the play, using another piece of evidence, a different piece of evidence, and making a different point. But this paragraph models clearly the different stages of that paragraph: the thesis statement, the evidence, the writer's method, the analysis of evidence, and then the link back to context and the writer's intention. So we're now going to move on to A Christmas Carol, the second text that you're going to be looking at tomorrow, and we're going to focus on Scrooge being the most important character in the play and really the central device that Dickens uses to convey his message. So again, like we did with Lady Macbeth, start with a mind map about Scrooge. What do we know about him? How is he presented by Dickens? Any quotes that you can remember, and how does he link to Dickens's intentions? Okay, so here are some of the things that you could have put on your mind map. I won't read them all out, but make sure that you read them through and add anything that you didn't get. They're under 2 headings. We've got Scrooge the sinner and Scrooge the changed man. So that's kind of the key movement of the character in the text, from a sinner, from a bad person, to a good person in his transformation and his redemption in the novel. So add any ideas that you didn't get from the notes on this slide. Okay, so we've now got our key ideas. What we now need to do is to turn them into a thesis statement, a response to a question. So if the question is, how does Dickens present Scrooge in A Christmas Carol? I want you to now use some of those ideas to come up with a short, concise thesis statement that sets out an answer to that point. Not just how the character is presented, but what he's there to represent and what he's there to teach us. Okay, so here is our model example. Again, I'm not going to read through it, but I want you to write down anything you didn't get, add to your own answer, and particularly notice how this answer focuses not just on how Scrooge is presented, but what he represents and what Dickens is trying to say through the character. Next step is to find some evidence. So we need key quotations from the text that we can remember and that we can put into our answer, because we're not going to have the text in front of us. So 3 or 4 quotes to talk about Scrooge's characterisation at the start, and also 3 or 4 quotes to talk about Scrooge's characterisation at the end of the novella. Okay, here are your suggested quotes, your suggested evidence. You can see we've got 4 there for Scrooge at the start and 4 there, Scrooge at the end. These aren't the only quotes that you could have used, but they're probably the most straightforward and easiest to remember, because you also need to analyse the quotes. Okay, and that's what we're going to go through on the next slide. But again, add any quotes that you didn't get to your own notes. So one of the key things you're going to be assessed on in your exam is your analysis of language. That means looking at a quote, picking out the keywords and thinking about A, what methods the writers used, but also the connotations of that word. What does the word make us think or feel? What do we associate with it, and particularly what does that make us, or what does that show us about the character or the theme that we're talking about, in this case about Scrooge. So here's one example. This is solitary as an oyster. So you can see there that I've explained the quote, I've talked about the method, which is a simile, I've looked at each word in particular, solitary, and the connotations as well as oyster, and I've also linked it to writer's intention. Okay, so that's an example. What I'd like you to do is go back to the list on slide 7 and choose another quote to explode on your own independently. So here's one example. This is solitary as an oyster. So you can see there that I've explained the quote, I've talked about the method, which is a simile, I've looked at each word in particular, solitary, and the connotations as well as oyster, and I've also linked it to writer's intention. Okay, so that's an example. What I'd like you to do is go back to the list on slide 7 and choose another quote to explode on your own independently. Okay, and lastly, here is our model paragraph. So I've taken everything that we've done so far, the thesis statement, the evidence, and the explosion, and I've put it into a paragraph. You can see there that the success criteria is highlighted, colour-coded. We've got our thesis statement, our response to the question, we've got our evidence, we've got the writer's method identified, we've got the analysis of evidence, and we've also got our links to context and particularly the writer's message or intentions. So that is a model answer for Scrooge at the start of the novella, using the quote solitary as an oyster. What I'd like you to do is to think about the quote that you've just exploded, a different one to a solitary as an oyster, and see if you can turn that into a model paragraph about Scrooge's presentation, either at the start of the novella or at the end.